This is the AMD Radeon R9 290. It was a high-end flagship back in 2013, and with all flagships, for the time, it had impressive ROPs, a huge amount of tensors and shaders. It could deal in 4K, even though that only the high and mighty 0.01% of the gaming population at the time were actually gaming in 4K. And that was in itself an impressive thing, and it posed a serious problem to Nvidia at the time. But the thing is, nowadays, Nvidia and AMD have other things on their minds. But you see, I don't, because yes, this card, it only has 4GB of VRAM. Yes, this card has a ridiculously high power draw. And yes, this card has a blower design, it's super noisy, looks dodgy, and it's AMD, so half of the world doesn't trust it anyway. But that's part of the reason why I love it so much. It's underrated, quite simply. You can pick one of these up for a ridiculous price, $40 in some cases. And the amount of performance this card gives you simply because of what it was designed for, high resolution, AAA titles. This is amazing value for money. It could very well be the perfect lockdown budget build graphics card you've been looking for. So first things first, if you're in the market for a cheap used AMD GPU, then you would probably be wondering, why not something more cozy, more consumer friendly, something more modern, something less precarious, something less radical? Well, something like the RX 580 we have here. Why not that? Well, I'll tell you why. This RX 580, yes, it has 8 gigs, but aside from that, imagine you were buying the 4 gigs version compared with the R9 290. What's so bad about that? Well, I'll tell you. Firstly, it's more modern. That means that on the used market, people will expect more for it. That's a lot more. So right now, on the US market, on the UK market, you could probably expect to have to pay anywhere between 120, 150 pounds for an RX 580 4 gig. Yes, and as I like to remind people, how much did I get this for? £50. And then when you see the charts as they're coming up now, you can clearly see that the performance difference between the two cards is not being that much after all. If you look, for example, say CSGO, the difference, I mean, there is still a difference, and it's probably because of the older architecture. There is a deficit, especially with the newer games that you can see that are being benchmarked here. But overall, the R9 290 is able to maintain a decent and comparative frame rate compared to the much newer RX 580. But where this card really starts to shine is where you look at titles like Quad Modern Warfare and Cyberpunk 2077. So in Cyberpunk, this is where the card gets really impressive, because if you look at Cyberpunk 2077, there's only 1 FPS difference. And then if you think about how the price of the RX 580 is infinitely higher, you will probably have to pay double for that on the used market, and how there's only 1 FPS difference. That is absolutely ludicrous, and it just shows that for that specific thing, if you're after high demand gaming and you don't have to have a high frame rate, then I mean, the R9 290 is your perfect choice. And yes, it's older, but I mean, just look at the graphs really, and it's also worth noting that yes, I run my benchmarking on an RX 580 8 gig, but what a lot of people don't know is that actually the amount of VRAM on a card doesn't make the difference in the frame rate. What the VRAM does, or increased amounts of VRAM do, is they prevent stuttering when you turn up the textures. The more VRAM you have, the higher the textures you can turn. But in terms of frame rate, it doesn't actually affect frame rate. But as I said, it does affect stuttering. In the same way, if you have too little RAM, for example, in a game like Flight Simulator 2020, a massively CPU bottlenecked game drawing loads of CPU power, you will get stuttering up to and including 32 gigabytes of RAM. If you have 8 gigabytes, you're going to get way more stuttering than at 32 gigabytes. And it's the same thing with VRAM, so it doesn't really make a difference in terms of frame rate, whether you're recording with the 8 gig or the 4 gig version. So then there's that. And then if we look at the R9 290 performing in Modern Warfare, it even overtakes the RX 580. Now I did double check this and it seems like it's correct. I mean, that in itself is pretty darn impressive. Obviously that game has been optimized very, very well. But that's another thing that you should notice about AMD versus Nvidia, and that is that AMD cards tend to age a lot better than their Nvidia counterparts, because AMD provides better long-term driver support because they work directly with Microsoft to deliver their DX12 API. Speaking of which, AMD cards, and especially the R9 290, benefited massively from the DX12 over DX11, and it just goes to show that this card is in it for the long run, because some of these Nvidia cards, they actually work worse on newer APIs like DX12 and Vulkan. So as we see here, where now we're comparing the R9 290 against the green team. Now I've chosen, I mean, there are a few GPUs I could have compared it to, like the GTX 970, but I chose to compare it to the 1650 because it's more modern. It's a very popular GPU, a lot of people are buying it, and yes, it is significantly more expensive. And then if you actually look at the way you pit the two GPUs together, now with all Nvidia products, they are significantly better in some games, but then again, Team Red does crawl back in certain titles. So for example, in Cyberpunk, again, the GTX 1650 Super was never meant to run Cyberpunk 2077, let's be clear. But if you ever wanted to run it, the R9 290 is a significantly cheaper option. Furthermore, if you look at things like Rise of the Tomb Raider, you look at Microsoft Flight Simulator. I mean, Microsoft Flight Simulator, these are super modern games running on this 7-year-old card, and there's only one FPS difference with an arguably low-end modern card. That just goes to show how this card has held up so well over the years. It is actually quite impressive. And if you look at it, I mean, these settings that I've put in for the benchmarks, they are not low, they are not insignificant. It is impressive. And I mean, yes, the i7 4770 is a little bit of a bottleneck, but I did make sure that these FPS figures, I mean, there is definitely a bottleneck for Cyberpunk 2077 and for Flight Simulator, but I did check that these figures are still representative of the graphics card's performance relative to each other. So, I mean, you hear a lot of reviewers nowadays, online reviewers, saying, oh, well, you shouldn't buy a graphics card for under £100, and they're recommending options like the GTX 1650 Super. Well, what they're doing is they're just following exactly what the corporate giants designed these cards and marketed them for. They marketed them for cheap and they want people to buy them, when in fact it is quite clear now that given these performance statistics, that is not half the performance, but it is more than half the price. If you look here, I've compiled some prices, so a new price, the online used price, and the street price, the most brutal, the kind of price you would get on Craigslist or Gumtree, depending on what place you are in the world. And yes, I know before I said pounds because I'm not in the United States, but most of you watching will probably be thinking in the United States dollar. So yes, the R9 290 compared to the RX 580 even, it's just so much cheaper because of its age. And of course, with all Nvidia cards, there is an Nvidia premium. It's something that you will get accustomed to if you're looking for GPUs on the used market. People trust Nvidia more than they do AMD. It's a brand thing, like trusting a sports car brand over a cheap car brand. People prefer it. They feel safer when buying an Nvidia product. And that is why, ultimately, Nvidia is never and will never be the ultimate budget option if you're looking to build something cheap, performing, and effective. And that is why the similarly performing RX 580 is cheaper than the GTX 1650 Super. So if you insist on a more modern card, go for an RX 580 4GB rather than a GTX 1650 Super. And then you might notice that it's pretty bizarre that the online used price and the street price of the RX 580 is really similar, and for that matter the new price. It's because This GPU has been mass produced and very cheaply so, especially by MSI, the board partner, and because of that, sometimes you will find that buying a brand new RX 580 4GB is cheaper than buying a used one. That's because someone bought it a long time ago when it was sold for a higher price, and now they think that they can have a reduced price on it, even though that the manufacturers beat them to it. And yes, as I've said, these GPUs have flooded the market, so getting an RX 580 for a good price, it's possible. But then again, if you are seriously on a budget, all those reviewers, they can tell you, oh, don't spend under £100. But I mean, if you want to get into the hobby and you categorically can't spend £100 on a graphics card, it's not that bad, because you can get performance equivalent to over £100 graphics cards, but for significantly less. And of course, as you can see, the Nvidia card is absolutely spanked by the AMD offerings in terms of price performance, and most of all the R9 290. So I mean, from this point, and given all of the benchmarks, it really isn't, it's just a no-brainer. Now, there are a few complications which I will address and have addressed, but just consider that as it is, and consider how people are marketing and arguing that Nvidia cards are good value for money when they're just really not. So that being said, while this architecture, the architecture on the R9 290 is old, it's not that old, and it's still a powerhouse. I mean, as I said, this was built for high resolution gaming, and while it may not be able to keep up to that and hold true to that claim today, with all of these modern games we have, it is still an insanely impressive card, and it translates that old high resolution performance into better lower resolution performance nowadays. For example, this card is specifically very good at increasing anti-aliasing settings. So you'll notice that if you're cranking up anti-aliasing on games and stuff with this card, that the performance hit will not be that bad, simply because of the amount of ROPs and little shader units and processors that this card actually has. As I said, architecture-wise, maybe not that great, but it was a big powerhouse back then, and I mean, compared to modern cards, it's not very impressive, but as a budget option, it's heavily underrated because of it. Okay, so it's been years since anyone's dared to implement a cooler blower design on a graphics card with a TDP of over 250 watts. Now this card, it has a TDP of over 250 watts. Now, does anyone remember the good old days where they put blower designs on those massive power drawing cards? Well, this is an homage to the good old days. So what I'm going to do is, if you see on the monitor, we have MSI Afterburner up, and this here is the fan speed. If I move it closer, that's the fan speed. We're currently at 38. All is relatively quiet and peaceful. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to turn it up to 100%. That's the apply button right there. Let's go. Yeah, that's extremely loud. This card is known for being one of the loudest cards out there. I'm not quite sure how many decibels. I think it's about 60. I will clarify, but that is seriously loud. Let's move a little closer to the actual source of this absolute racket. Look at the card. I mean, it is. Can you even hear me anymore? It's that loud. It's just extremely loud. Utterly savage. Spinning very, very fast. But I mean, it's impressive. The card has legacy. It has a legacy to leave behind it, if nothing else. So, we've done a lot of faffing around with benchmarks and the acoustics of the card, but before we wrap up, I want to mention a few things. I want to address a few things. Firstly, the elephant in the room, something I didn't really mention before. I didn't really want to, but the TDP of this card is 250 watts. Now that sounds pretty scary, but it isn't, I promise you, because the average gaming PC nowadays at least has a power supply of about 600 watts. So this card in itself is actually rated and recommended for 600 watt power supplies, because yes, the power draw is quite high, but with a decent high quality PSU, it should be able to handle it just fine, providing you have the 6-pin and 8-pin power connectors required. As for the cooling system for such a high TDP, yes, it is a bit of a concern, which is why the card is famous for being louder than other cards, most notably cards with a more conventional and more expensive dual fan configuration. But then again, you can also buy this card on the used market with that cooling configuration, especially if you want to overclock this card. I wouldn't recommend doing it on this unless you want to completely give up on decent acoustics. But then again, you shouldn't be too worried about acoustics with this card, because I have actually managed to undervolt the card, which means that I have reduced the amount of power that's being supplied to the card without there being much of a performance hit. This means that the card in itself runs significantly cooler. In fact, I've been able to reduce it so much that the power draw of this card, as it currently stands, is approximately 208 watts. That is a significant, almost 40-50 watts reduction in power draw. Now that increases the cooling capability significantly, reduces temps, and therefore it reduces the acoustics, which means that I'm able to run this under stress at 65 degrees approximately, and the cooling is reasonably quiet with the fan rarely spinning above 60%, and even then it's reasonably quiet. And if you think about it, I don't even have it in a case, as you saw. So if you included a case, if you put it in a case, and a decently high quality case, the acoustics would absolutely not be a problem. So if you're worried about acoustics, yes, but it's manageable, utterly manageable. And with new upcoming softwares, especially MSI Afterburner, that's been around for quite a long time, you can customize the hell out of the fan configuration. You can set it to do exactly what you want it to do. So, with that all being said, is this card for you? Well, I would say that if you're quite gullible, if you have more money than sense, if you actually believe the reviewers who tell you that it's not a good idea to spend below $100 or pounds for a GPU when they themselves have GPUs above £2,000, they swim in RTX 3090s while the rest of us have to scrabble for them on the market. If you believe them, if you have more money than sense, or if you're scared to enter the cold waters of the used market, get a GTX 1650. If you're scared of the used market, but you do understand the definition of value for money, get an RX 580. But neither of those two cards is anything compared to the value for money of this. So, neither of those cards is for me. This is. So if you are orientated towards value, if you want proper performance, if you want to be able to play every single game that was released in the last year, if you want powerful computing, if you are a budgeteer, this is the only card you can choose out of those three. Because I would correct you there, this isn't the only good option or equivalent, because AMD had subsequently released an 8GB version of this card, namely the R9 390, and while I would say personally that 4GB of VRAM is needed in 2020, 2021, you don't necessarily have to go higher, especially given how 8GB cards, the cheapest 8GB cards you can get on the used market, are all of a sudden double and 3 times as costly as the most expensive and reasonable 4GB cards like this. So from a price performance perspective, going from 4GB to 8GB is not necessarily a good idea, and yes, you do need every single one of those 4GB for decent gameplay, and as you saw, it is possible, but you don't really need higher than that unless you have specific demands. So yes, if you're a budgeteer, if you're orientated around performance and value, and don't want to compromise on any of them, including acoustics, the R9 290 is yours. If you appreciate a clear, uncompromising and straightforward take on hardware, and if you appreciate a clear and insightful outlook on where the true value for money lies. If you want to know and understand how you could end up paying 1/10 of what other people would pay to play the same game, then subscribe and like the video. And stay tuned, because I will be soon putting up a video about a £300 water cooling gaming PC to shame them all. Who said that value for money, performance and style didn't go together?